True Haunted Apartment Stories. Part 1. The Echoes in the Hallway. Jamie had always been a city girl at heart, so moving to the bustling urban landscape to start her new job felt like a dream come true. The apartment she had found was small but perfect for someone like her. Independent, ambitious, and ready to take on the world. It was located on Mercer Avenue, an older building with character, nestled at the edge of the city. The noise of the streets outside felt like a constant hum in the background, but the large window in her living room offered a view that created a sense of distance, as though the chaos of the world was happening just far enough away that she could almost forget about it. At first, everything felt right. The apartment had its quirks. The floors creaked under her weight. The walls had old paint that might have once been bright, but had since dulled over the years. But there was a comforting familiarity to it all. It was a home, and for Jamie, that was all she needed. Her evenings were filled with quiet, her only company being the distant sounds of traffic and the occasional murmur from the neighbours. It was peaceful. But as the days went by, that peace started to crack, slowly and insidiously. The first sign of something wrong was so subtle, Jamie almost dismissed it. It was the hallway, the corridor outside her apartment, the one she had to walk down every day, had a strange, unsettling vibe to it. The light overhead would flicker occasionally, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls that seemed to stretch farther than they should have. At first, Jamie didn't think much of it. The building was old, and things like flickering lights happened in places like this. But the silence in the hallway was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The real unease began one late evening. Jamie had returned home later than usual after a long day at work. She was tired, the weight of the day clinging to her shoulders as she made her way up the stairs. When she reached the second floor, the familiar quiet of the hallway felt thicker than usual, almost suffocating. She paused at her door, fishing for her keys, and for a split second, she could have sworn she heard something, a sound, faint, distant. It was the faintest echo of a footstep, like someone walking far down the hall, the sound of shoes scuffing against the worn floorboards. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the building settling, as buildings like this do. But the moment she stepped inside, the sound echoed again. This time, it wasn't a footstep. It was a whisper. Her heart skipped. The voice was soft, just a murmur, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like a person calling out, as if they were standing just outside her door. She froze, holding her breath, waiting for it to happen again. Nothing. The silence returned, and the usual comforting hum of the city below filled the room once more. But it wasn't enough to reassure her. Something had shifted. Days passed, and the whispers continued. At first, they were faint and sporadic. Sometimes they were nothing more than an unsettling murmur when she was near the window. Sometimes they seemed to come from the direction of the hallway, and other times, most disturbing of all, she would hear them at night, just before she fell asleep. She convinced herself it was just her imagination running wild. It was a new apartment, a new place to call home, and maybe her mind was just adjusting to the unfamiliar. But one night, that assumption was put to the test. It was around 2 a.m. when Jamie woke, thirsty, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. The apartment was silent as usual. She poured the water and was about to take a sip when she heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it was clearer, closer. It was coming from the hallway, right outside her door. She set the glass down, her heart pounding as she approached the door cautiously. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to listen. The words were still indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like someone or something was trying to say her name. A chill ran down her spine. "Jamie." The voice was faint but clear, and her blood ran cold. The sound was too distinct to be ignored. With a trembling hand, she slowly opened the door just enough to peek into the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. But the oppressive silence that followed was worse than the whispering. It was as if the very air in the corridor had thickened, suffocating her. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she closed the door quickly and locked it. The whispers had stopped, but the fear remained. Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The apartment, which had once felt like her safe haven, now seemed like a place where the walls were closing in on her. A space where she wasn't alone, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise. The next few days were filled with a constant sense of dread. Every time Jamie left her apartment, she couldn't help but feel a growing anxiety when she walked through the hallway. It was always silent, unnervingly silent. The strange thing was, no one ever seemed to be around. No footsteps in the distance. No sounds of doors opening or closing. It was as if she was the only one left in the building. One afternoon, after a particularly tense day at work, Jamie returned home, her nerves frayed. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her mind preoccupied with the worries of the day. But the moment she closed the door behind her, the atmosphere in the apartment felt different, heavier somehow. The air felt dense, as though it was thick with anticipation. She moved to the window, looking out over the street below. But as she did, a sharp noise caught her attention. It was the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. The noise came from the hallway, scraping, slow, deliberate. Her heart skipped in her chest. Jamie froze. This wasn't the wind or the building settling. This was something or someone moving in the hallway. She stood there, listening, her body rigid with fear. Then the sound stopped. Complete silence. For a moment, Jamie thought she might have imagined it. But deep down, she knew that something was wrong. In a daze, she walked to the door and opened it a crack. She peered out, but there was no one there. Yet, the hallway was bathed in a sickly yellow light from the overhead fixture, casting long shadows against the walls. Something was different now. The hallway didn't feel like a part of the building anymore. It felt like a space outside of time, a threshold between two worlds. Jamie's breath caught in her throat when she noticed it. A message scrawled hastily on the wall at the end of the hallway. The letters were jagged, the writing wild, like someone had scratched it into the surface in desperation. It read, "Leave before it's too late." Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the wall, the coldness of the words biting into her fingertips. The writing was fresh, almost as if it had been done moments ago. But how? Who had written it? And why? As her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, the temperature in the hallway dropped suddenly. The air grew frigid, and Jamie could see her breath forming in the chill. The shadows around her seemed to stretch unnaturally, distorting into shapes she couldn't understand. She stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The voice, the whispers, the strange occurrences in the hallway, it all began to fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be completed. And then, just as she turned to slam the door shut, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But this time, they were coming closer. A slow, deliberate pacing. Step by step, they echoed down the hall, growing louder, louder until they stopped right outside her door. Her heart raced as she pressed her back against the door, her breath shallow and fast. The footsteps were gone now, but the feeling remained. Jamie was no longer alone. The apartment, once a place of safety and independence, had become a trap, and she was its prisoner. She slammed the door shut and bolted it, but deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Something had awoken in the building, something old and vengeful, and Jamie was in its sights. The echoes in the hallway were not just footsteps. They were a warning, and Jamie had no idea how much time she had left before whatever it was reached her. Part 2. The Haunting of Apartment 14. Ethan had always considered himself rational, logic-driven, grounded, and mostly uninterested in things like ghost stories or urban legends. When he found the third-floor apartment for rent just a block away from campus, it seemed like a practical solution to his housing problem. The price was surprisingly reasonable, and the building, though aged and slightly worn, had a kind of antique charm to it. High ceilings, decorative molding, and heavy wooden doors that spoke of another era. Apartment 16, his new home, sat just a few doors down from apartment 14, which at the time meant nothing to him. From the moment he moved in, Ethan noticed something off about the building. The halls were always quiet, unnervingly so, and though there were other tenants on his floor, he rarely saw them. The air had a strange stillness to it, like a library after hours. The hallway outside his door never seemed to fully warm up, no matter the time of day. There was always a draft, a whisper of cold that clung to the walls and brushed against his skin like breath. He didn't think much of it at first. College kept him busy. Lectures, late-night study sessions, campus events. His life was full and distracted. But the quiet in the building had a way of creeping into his thoughts when he finally got home. There was one door he always passed, apartment 14. It was painted the same dull beige as the others, but the number on the door was worn, almost smudged, like it had been scratched at repeatedly. No sounds ever came from inside. No music, no conversations, no TV noise. It stood, unlit and untouched, like a forgotten room in a museum. One late afternoon, Ethan returned from class and saw an envelope taped to his door. It was unmarked. Inside was a single slip of paper that read, "Do not trust the silence." No name, no signature, just those 5 words. He chuckled at first, assuming it was some kind of prank. But that night, the silence stopped being peaceful. It began with a scratching sound, not in his apartment, but in the walls. A low, rhythmic scrape, as if something sharp was being dragged in slow, deliberate circles behind the plaster. It would start just after midnight and continue until dawn. He pressed his ear to the wall, trying to find its source. Sometimes it came from behind his closet, other times from the shared wall between his apartment and apartment 14. Curiosity, of course, soon turned to obsession. Ethan began staying up later, pressing a glass to the walls, trying to record the sounds on his phone. They never played back the way he remembered them. The recordings were faint, distant, as though whatever he had heard had only existed in real time. Still, the more he listened, the more convinced he became that the scratching wasn't random. It was patterned, purposeful, intentional. One evening, he ran into Claire, a second-year student who lived in the apartment across the hall. She had always kept to herself, but that night, as Ethan stepped out into the hallway, she was standing there staring at apartment 14. "Did you hear it last night?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I've been hearing it for months." Claire didn't need much convincing to talk. She revealed that apartment 14 had a history. It had been the scene of a disappearance 2 years prior. A student named Daniel had lived there briefly and was last seen entering his apartment late one night. No one ever saw him again. His belongings remained untouched. No sign of forced entry, no foul play, just a locked door and a boy who never came back out. The building management eventually cleared the apartment and claimed he had left on his own accord. But no one believed it. Claire had her own stories. Whispers in the hallway. Objects disappearing and returning in odd places. Once she said she saw movement in apartment 14's window, even though it had been unoccupied for months. The management refused to discuss it. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. Around 3 a.m., the scratching returned, louder now. He followed the sound to his living room wall, which he now knew bordered the empty apartment next door. The rhythm had changed. It wasn't scratching anymore. It sounded like writing, a steady drag of something sharp against the wall. The next day, against his better judgment, Ethan approached apartment 14. He touched the doorknob. It was cold, far colder than the rest of the hallway. He hesitated, then knocked. No answer. He tried again. Still silence. 2 days later, Ethan awoke to find his own apartment rearranged. Not in a messy way, but meticulously. His books were stacked by colour. His desk drawers reorganised. Even his bathroom cabinet had been sorted, alphabetically. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. But the violation of space sent a shock through his chest. He called the building manager, who claimed no one had accessed his unit. That same night, a loud thud echoed from the hallway. He opened his door and stepped out, only to see apartment 14's door ajar. The first time since he moved in. Without thinking, he stepped toward it. Inside, the apartment was dark and untouched. Furniture covered in white sheets. Dust thick on the floor. It smelled like mold and something older, wood rot maybe. He moved cautiously, phone flashlight in hand. Everything seemed still until he entered the bedroom. There, carved into the wall above the bed, were hundreds of tiny markings. Names, dates, some crossed out, some faded, but one name was fresh. Ethan. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and bumped into something solid. He turned, but there was no one there, just cold air. Panicked, he rushed back to his unit. He locked the door, bolted it, and sat in the center of the room trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The name. It hadn't just been written. It had been carved, scratched in deeply with something sharp. The next day, Claire didn't answer her door. By evening, the police had been called. Her apartment was found empty, everything left behind. No note, no struggle, just silence. That night, Ethan had a dream. He was standing in the hallway, staring at apartment 14. The door opened slowly, and inside was Daniel, Claire, and someone else. Himself. The version of him in the dream turned, looked into his eyes and whispered, "Now it's your turn." He woke up screaming. The walls were scratching again, only now they weren't random. They were writing, again and again in rhythm. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a haunting. It was a calling. And something inside apartment 14 wanted him. Desperation creeping in, Ethan packed a bag that night, ready to leave. But when he opened the front door, the hallway had changed. It wasn't the same long corridor he walked every day. It was endless, dark, silent, stretching out in both directions with no end in sight. He stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. And then the scratching stopped. The silence returned, and the walls began to breathe. Part 3. The Maintenance Man Who Never Left. Samantha had always found comfort in structure. As a registered nurse working the night shift at St. Lucia Hospital on the edge of the city, her life followed a pattern: long hours, late dinners, and quiet solitude when the world was still asleep. She cherished coming home to her small ground-floor apartment, tucked inside the aging building on Mercer Avenue, the same building where Ethan and Jamie lived, just floors above her. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. A soft couch, the hum of her old fridge, and a view of the quiet alley made her space feel like an island after the chaos of the ER. The first time she met George, she had just moved in. He knocked on her door, introduced himself as the building's maintenance man, and offered to help install her curtain rods. He had a peculiar politeness, one that felt too measured, too rehearsed. But she was tired, and his offer seemed harmless. George was in his mid-50s, wore faded overalls and a name tag that looked like it belonged to a different decade. His eyes were dark and unreadable behind thick glasses, and his voice was low, almost too soft, like every word had been carefully trimmed. At first, she appreciated having someone like George around. He fixed leaky pipes, replaced light bulbs, and even brought her mail when it ended up in the wrong box. But over time, his helpfulness turned into something else. He started showing up unannounced, usually when she was home alone after a long shift. One night, she returned to find her front door slightly ajar. She panicked, thinking she had been robbed, but everything was untouched. A note sat on her kitchen table in neat block handwriting. Just checking on things, George. Samantha felt the first chill of fear then, a quiet shiver she brushed off far too quickly. She confronted him the next day. He smiled with that same vacant expression and said, "I've always looked after this building. Some tenants need a little more looking after than others." He laughed softly after saying it, but there was no warmth in the sound. From then on, things began to escalate. Her toothbrush went missing for 2 days, then reappeared in the freezer. She'd find her favorite mug filled with water, even though she hadn't used it. Her clothes, once folded in drawers, were shuffled or oddly damp. But what disturbed her most were the small, unexplained footprints she found near her bed one morning, barefoot, adult-sized, and faintly imprinted in a fine layer of dust. She began locking every door and window, sleeping with a flashlight in her hand and a kitchen knife tucked under her pillow. She even installed a camera in her living room, but the footage would always cut to static at random times during the night. She reported it to the landlord, but he brushed her off, saying George had been there for years and had never caused trouble. That was when she began asking questions. She learned from an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, that George had once lived in the building himself, decades ago. He had lost his wife to illness, and something about him had never been quite right since. He had stayed on as the unofficial caretaker, even after his unit had been taken over by new tenants. "He's part of the building now," she said softly, with a kind of resigned fear that haunted Samantha more than the words themselves. Then came the night Samantha decided she'd had enough. She was packing her bags. It was nearly 3 a.m. when she was startled by the sound of humming coming from her bathroom. She froze, every muscle tensing as the familiar melody of "You Are My Sunshine" echoed faintly down the hallway. That had been her mother's lullaby when she was a child. No one else would know that. She crept down the hallway, her flashlight flickering in her hand. The bathroom light was off, the door cracked slightly open. She pushed it gently and gasped. The mirror was covered in writing, smeared like it had been traced with a wet finger. Dozens of phrases, over and over. "You're not alone. I'm still here. Don't leave me." Suddenly, the lights shut off. Her flashlight blinked and died. Samantha stumbled backward into the hallway, her breath shallow, heart hammering. From the kitchen, she heard a whisper. Her name, stretched thin like a breath through cracked lips. She ran, out the front door, down the hallway, barefoot and shaking. But as she turned the corner toward the building's rear exit, she froze. Standing at the end of the hall was George. He wasn't moving, just staring, head tilted slightly to the side. "You don't have to leave," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I made this place for you. I made it safe." Samantha backed away, her hands trembling. "What do you mean?" What did you do? George took a slow step forward. This building. She listens. She watches. And she gave me a purpose. To protect it. To protect you. But you have to stay. You have to listen. Samantha turned and fled down the stairs. She didn't stop until she was outside in the freezing air, barefoot on the concrete, chest heaving. When the police arrived, she reported everything. The notes, the break-ins, the humming. But when they searched the building, George was nowhere to be found. The landlord swore George had quit 2 weeks earlier, left a note on his desk, and disappeared. His keys had been returned, and no one had seen him since. Inside Samantha's apartment, the police found something she hadn't noticed before. Behind the bedroom wall, hidden under peeling wallpaper, was a small cutout window into the maintenance crawl space. In it, a blanket, a notebook, and dozens of photographs of Samantha taken while she was asleep. The final photo, time-stamped just hours before, was taped to the inside of the crawl space. In it, she was lying in bed, unaware, and in the shadow behind her, George stood, smiling. She never returned to that apartment, moved to a different city. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, Samantha swears she hears humming through the vents, and she wonders if the building ever really let her go. Part 4. The Bloodstained Hallway. Max had always prided himself on being rational, someone who didn't scare easily, someone who looked for answers before jumping to conclusions. When he relocated to the city for a marketing job at a rising startup, he was thrilled to find a sleek, modern apartment on the top floor of a newly renovated high-rise. The place was immaculate. Granite countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of downtown that sparkled at night. It felt like the fresh start he needed after years of working from his childhood bedroom in a small Midwestern town. His unit was 5D. Down the hall, past the elevator and the stairwell, was apartment 5A, which the leasing office told him was unoccupied, pending renovation. He remembered asking about it simply out of curiosity. The door had looked older than the others, its paint slightly chipped, the number plate crooked as if someone had tried to rip it off. The building manager chuckled and said the previous tenant had moved out abruptly, but that they'd be updating it soon. Max didn't give it another thought. The first week passed without incident. Max found comfort in the quietness of the building and the predictability of his routine. But as he settled in, he began to notice something odd, especially about the hallway. It was always cold, not mildly cold from bad insulation, but unseasonably, unnaturally cold. Even on warm days, when sunlight drenched his windows, the hallway was frigid, as if the air had been taken from a cellar and pumped through the walls. The motion-detecting lights overhead would sometimes take a second too long to click on, leaving him standing in darkness, waiting, the silence pressing in from all sides. Then there was the noise. At night, long after he'd returned home, Max would sometimes hear footsteps. They weren't heavy, but soft and quick, like someone was pacing. He assumed it was one of the neighbors, until he realized the sound always stopped the moment he opened his door. When he looked out, the hallway was empty. That particular stretch of silence, the instant shift from movement to stillness, began to unnerve him more than the sound itself. One Thursday morning, as Max left for work, he froze at the threshold. Just a few feet away, smeared across the hallway floor, was a dark streak. It looked like something had been dragged. The streak extended from the stairwell to just outside the door of apartment 5A. It wasn't just dirt or water. It was deep red. He knelt down, half expecting it to be paint, maybe some kind of construction residue, but the smell hit him. Iron, sharp, unmistakable. Blood. Max called the front desk. They arrived a few minutes later with 2 maintenance workers and a security guard. They inspected the hallway but downplayed it. "Must be a spill," the manager muttered. "Maybe from the roof. A pipe leak." Max watched as one of the maintenance guys wiped the streak with a towel. The rag came away soaked in red. The hallway was scrubbed, and he was told not to worry. But Max couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, he stood by his peephole for hours, listening, waiting. Nothing happened. The next morning, however, was different. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw something taped to apartment 5A's door. A single piece of paper, folded in half, with his name scrawled across the front in childlike handwriting. His blood chilled as he opened it. Inside, written in red ink, were 3 words, "You saw it." Max's hands trembled. He looked around, but the hallway was empty. He quickly returned to his apartment, locking every bolt behind him. His thoughts spiraled. Who left the note? What had he actually seen? He tried to rationalize it, tried to believe it was a prank, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The building was too quiet, too perfect, and now it felt watched. Over the next few days, the atmosphere shifted. Max started receiving phone calls with no one on the other end. The elevator would sometimes stop at the 5th floor without being called. He would find his door slightly ajar, even though he was certain he'd locked it. Worst of all, the blood returned. A new trail, leading from the stairwell to apartment 5A, just like before. This time, it was thicker, fresher. He contacted the police. They came, took notes, took photos, and promised to investigate. But there was no follow-up, no questions, no urgency, as if they'd seen this before. On Sunday evening, unable to sleep, Max sat on his couch with a glass of water, watching a movie on low volume. Around 2 a.m., the power cut out. The apartment went dark. At first, he thought it was a blackout. But when he looked out the window, the city lights still burned bright. It was just his apartment. The silence inside was thick, heavy. He reached for his phone to use the flashlight when he heard it. Breathing, not his own. Shallow, labored, close. It was coming from the hallway. Max stood still, holding his breath. The sound came again. He crept toward his door, leaned in, and peeked through the peephole. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the stairwell. A man, barefoot, dressed in what looked like hospital scrubs, smeared with something dark. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. He staggered toward apartment 5A and stopped at the door. Slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at Max's door, as if he could see through the peephole. Max stumbled backward, panic flooding his chest. A moment later, there was a knock. Not at 5A, at his door. It was soft, almost polite. Then it came again. A second knock, louder, slower, deliberate. Max didn't move. He didn't breathe. The knocking stopped. The next morning, he found another note under his door. "It's your turn." Desperate, Max went to the building's archives at City Hall, pretending to be a student writing a paper on local architecture. What he found stunned him. The high-rise had been built over the ruins of an old tenement that had burned down in the late 70s. Dozens had died, many of them trapped in their units. The fire had started, the record said, in a unit that corresponded, geographically, to apartment 5A. Returning to the building, Max felt the weight of history press against his chest. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, lights on, doors locked, armed with a baseball bat. But it didn't matter. At 3:33 a.m., his front door unlocked by itself, slowly, quietly. The door creaked open. No one was there. But in the hallway, just at the edge of the light, stood the man in hospital scrubs, motionless. And then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into apartment 5A. The door shut behind him. Max left the building the next day. He didn't pack. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even break his lease. He just ran and never looked back. But sometimes in his new apartment, far from that hallway, he still wakes up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, just outside his door. Part 5. The Shadows in the Walls. Lily had always believed that a new space could change a life. That's what she told herself when she signed the lease on the new apartment complex, tucked just outside the heart of the city. After years of struggling through temp jobs, couch surfing, and the quiet ache of independence never quite grasped, this place felt like a declaration of arrival. The complex was still under construction in some wings, its fresh concrete and sterile white walls giving off the scent of newness that made her feel clean, unburdened, almost invisible to the chaos of her past. Her unit, 3B, was sunlit and open, with sleek cabinetry and laminate floors that glowed when the morning light poured in. It was perfect, or so she thought. The first few nights were uneventful. Lily unpacked slowly, layering her new space with pieces of herself. Photos, books, little plants she hoped wouldn't die. She worked remotely, freelancing for marketing firms, and the silence of the building was a blessing. Few neighbours had moved in yet, and the construction zone at the far end of the hall remained sealed off with plastic sheeting. But it didn't take long for the silence to shift from peaceful to oppressive. At night, the walls whispered. At first, it was soft enough to ignore, like faint drafts, wind between window panes, or perhaps just the hum of the building adjusting to occupancy. But then it became clearer, more distinct. It wasn't white noise, it was voices. They didn't speak in full sentences, only fragments, murmurs that vanished the moment she leaned closer. Sometimes it sounded like her name being drawn out. Sometimes it was laughter. And other times, most terrifying of all, it was weeping. Quiet, anguished, unmistakably human weeping, pressed right against the drywall, as though someone was crying with their face just inches from the other side. Lily tried to rationalize it. Maybe sound was traveling oddly through the unfinished hallways. Maybe there were other tenants she hadn't met. But these were empty excuses. The whispers always came when the building was still, after midnight, when even the construction crew had long gone home. She brought it up casually to the property manager, but the woman smiled too quickly and said it was probably the pipes. New buildings settle, she added with a shrug. It was hard to sleep. Lily began leaving the hallway light on, then eventually the kitchen light too. But the shadows kept returning, not just in the dark corners of her vision, but in her reflection. One night, brushing her teeth, she glimpsed a shape behind her in the bathroom mirror. A dark silhouette, tall and still. But when she turned, there was no one there. Then the dream started. They were vivid and disjointed, but always in the same place, her apartment. In the dreams, the walls bled, the shadows grew long and clawed, and there was a voice beneath the floor whispering her name over and over again. When she woke up, she'd find scratches on the walls, indentations in her mattress, smudges on the inside of her windows. At first, she thought she was sleepwalking, caught in the throes of a growing paranoia. But one morning, she discovered a phrase carved into the back of her bedroom closet door. They're not gone. That day, Lily didn't leave her apartment. She sat on the couch, phone in hand, ready to call someone. Anyone, but afraid of what she might say. She started searching online, digging through public records, and eventually unearthed something that made her breath catch. The land her building was on had once belonged to a privately run institution that had closed in the 1960s under ethical violations. The details were scarce, But a few forums claimed that the original building had been a mental hospital, hastily shut down and demolished after several patients vanished without explanation. The bodies were never found. Rumors of mass graves, unmarked burials, and strange rituals swirled, but no official records confirmed any of it. The next night, the whispering intensified. It no longer felt like it came from the walls. It felt like it came from inside the apartment. The air was thick, heavy with something Lily couldn't name. Her plants withered overnight. Her fridge began to hum erratically, and the lights flickered even when the power hadn't gone out. She tried burning sage, hanging crystals, praying. None of it worked. Desperate, she reached out to a local paranormal researcher she found through a community thread. His name was Elijah, a former theology student who had turned his obsession with spiritual residue into a consulting gig. He arrived 2 days later, a tall man with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He walked the apartment slowly, saying nothing at first, just running his hands over the walls, the floor, the corners. After a long silence, he finally said, "They're still here. You're living on a wound that never healed." When she asked him what to do, he gave her a warning instead. "There's something in this space that was never meant to rest. You can't banish it. You can only survive it. But if they've started speaking to you, it means they've chosen you, or they remember you." Lily didn't know what he meant by that last part. She didn't ask. The next night was the worst. It started with static on her phone, even in airplane mode. Then the shadows returned, thicker this time, curling around the edges of the room like smoke. The weeping began again, louder, more guttural. Lily sat frozen in her bed, clutching the blanket as her bedroom door creaked open on its own. She stared into the hallway, empty and dark. Then the lights died. In total blackness, something moved, slithering along the floor, breathing, its presence heavier than anything she had ever known. She reached blindly for her phone, tried to turn on the flashlight, but the screen was dead. And then the voice returned, clear, and right behind her ear. "You lived here before." Her scream was swallowed by the darkness. When the power returned at dawn, she found herself lying on the bedroom floor, nails broken, blood on her fingertips, as though she'd been clawing at the walls. The room smelled of ash. The word "remember" had been scratched into the window pane from the inside. She left that morning with only a backpack and her keys. A week later, she received a package at a friend's house where she'd been crashing since. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It was old, black and white, clearly from decades ago. It showed the inside of what appeared to be a patient ward. Concrete floors, metal-framed beds, nurses in uniform. Standing near the back, half hidden in the shadows, was a little girl. She had Lily's face. But the photo was dated 1959. She dropped it, her knees giving way. Lily never returned to apartment 3B. But sometimes, when she walks by empty buildings, she swears she hears her name echoing through the brick. And worse still, she feels like something is waiting, not behind her, but inside her, in the quiet corridors of Mercer Avenue's aging complex. Beneath the surface of fresh paint and new beginnings, 5 souls encountered something that would change them forever. Each believed they were simply moving into an apartment, another step in the journey toward adulthood, independence, or renewal. But behind every door, in every crack of drywall, there lingered something ancient, something watching, something waiting. Jamie, bright-eyed and newly independent, found herself haunted not by a ghost she could see, but by the overwhelming presence of something that refused to let itself be known. Her journey began with whispers, gentle at first like wind, then more insistent, more human. The hallway outside her door became a breathing, pulsing thing, and one note, just a simple, hand-scrawled warning, shattered the illusion that she was ever truly alone. The apartment became her prison, And even when she thought she was imagining things, even when she hoped she was overthinking, the hallway answered with footsteps and breath. Jamie didn't just face a haunting, she faced the terrifying truth that sometimes the place meant to protect you can turn into something that feeds on your presence. Ethan's story took us deeper into the building's past. As a college student chasing comfort and affordability, he unknowingly stepped into the echo of tragedy that had never quite died. Apartment 14 wasn't just abandoned, it was wounded. Something there remembered pain, and it was hungry for company. What began as strange noises and shadows escalated into messages scrawled in blood and visions of those who had vanished before him. Ethan, once logical and grounded, found himself unraveling, drawn into the rhythm of something ancient that fed on silence and memory. He became part of the mystery he had once dismissed, a name on the wall, a whisper in someone else's dream. Then came Samantha, whose story reminded us that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear maintenance uniforms and smile too politely. Her encounter with George was not supernatural in the beginning. It was human, and that made it all the more terrifying. The invasion of her space, the quiet obsession, the humming in the bathroom that only she recognized, all these pieces fit together in a way that made her feel not just watched, but claimed. George was more than a man. He was a symbol of the building itself, obsessive, possessive, ancient. And in the walls of her home, she found more than photographs and peeping holes. She found the realization that danger could exist in the routine, in the overlooked, in the helpful smile of someone who never truly left. Max's descent was perhaps the most chilling in its subtlety. A young professional chasing success, he moved into what seemed like a dream, a luxury unit, modern design, prestige. But beneath the pristine surface was a building built on ash and bones, trails of blood, a door that never opened but always knew your name. Max's unraveling came not in one loud scream, but in small, quiet moments. A note, a knock, a man in scrubs pointing at him in the dark. The horror was not in the haunting itself, but in the helplessness. How easily it found him, how quickly it turned his rational world into one of superstition and flight. He ran, but even he knew deep down that some doors, once opened, follow you forever. And finally, there was Lily, the dreamer, the survivor, the one who thought she had escaped her past by stepping into something new. But in doing so, she stepped into herself. The shadows in her walls weren't just ghosts. They were memories. The building remembered her, not because it wanted to haunt her, but because she had been there before. Her entire life unraveled as the whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, until she found a photograph that shattered everything she thought she knew about who she was. Her haunting wasn't a new beginning, it was a return, a loop, a memory relived. And the building wasn't just haunted, it was home.
What ties all 5 stories together is more than just setting. It's intimacy. The idea that a home, the most personal of spaces, can betray you. That your own 4 walls can listen to your fears, amplify them, and reflect them back in terrible, contorted ways. These stories remind us that the supernatural isn't always about ghosts or demons. Sometimes it's about memory, about space, about energy that doesn't forget.
The building on Mercer Avenue, though fictional in name, represents something very real. The legacy of places. The imprints we leave behind and those left before us. Trauma doesn't vanish when drywall is replaced or floors are retiled. Energy lingers, stories remain, whispers return. These 5 characters stepped into stories already in motion, and in doing so, they became part of them. The building didn't just house them, it absorbed them. There is a deeper truth pulsing through the shadows of these tales. Your environment matters more than you think. Where you live, where you rest, dream, cry, sleep, holds on to you. We often treat our homes like containers, blank slates, but the truth is, homes carry weight. Whether emotional, historical, or spiritual, every space we occupy has a story, and we have to ask ourselves, are we writing our own or living someone else's?
From these stories, we learn the importance of listening to our intuition. Every character had a moment, a small, gnawing whisper of doubt that they ignored. The strange behavior, the unexplained cold, the sound in the walls. They dismissed it. We do the same in real life. We brush off red flags in relationships, in jobs, in situations that feel wrong because we're told we're overreacting. But these stories tell us, listen, your fear is trying to protect you.
And perhaps most hauntingly, the stories remind us that some doors, once opened, never fully close. That curiosity, when it steps beyond caution, can pull you into a place you were never meant to be. There is bravery in facing the unknown, but wisdom in knowing when to walk away.
In our modern lives, we are constantly searching for space, a new apartment, a new city, a new beginning. We crave escape from our pasts, from our pain, from our uncertainty. But we cannot outrun ourselves. Wherever we go, we bring energy with us. Healing does not come from fresh walls, but from inner work. Be mindful of where you place yourself, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Cleanse not just your home, but your heart. Respect the histories of the places you enter. Honor the lives lived before yours. And when you feel something isn't right, when the hallway is too quiet, the air too still, or the voice in your gut screams, go, listen. These stories are fictional, yes, but the feelings they stir are real, and they tap into something deep within us all. The fear of being unseen, unheard, and ultimately forgotten. These characters remind us that connection to self, to space, to story is everything. If these stories moved you, disturbed you, made you feel something, whether it was fear, empathy, or even reflection, then stay with us. There are more stories to tell,
More shadows to explore.
and more truths hiding in the walls.
It's your way of lighting a candle in the dark, of saying, yes, I'm listening, I want more. It fuels our fire and gives us the energy to keep unearthing these stories, these voices that still linger in the forgotten corners of buildings, of memories, of lives.
So if you're ready to keep going, if you want to see what else lies just beyond the door, and remember, not every haunting ends when the story does. Sometimes it's just the beginning.